Now let's begin our chapter on the lymphatic and immune systems. It might be quite surprising to find out that the body harbors about 10,000 times as many bacterial cells as there are human cells. Some of these bacterial cells are beneficial, and some of them are potentially disease-causing if homeostasis doesn't keep it all in check. It's evident that upon death, when homeostasis fails, this goes out of check as we are overrun and consumed by microbes. In this chapter, we explore the immune system, which is not technically an organ system. It's just a population of cells that inhabit all of our organs and defend the body from agents of disease. Immune cells were first identified in starfish or sea stars, when a Russian zoologist observed that there were mobile cells wandering throughout their bodies. It turned out that these were cells of the immune system. So throughout our bodies, we see cells like macrophages wandering about, cleaning up all the trash and taking care of the cleanup of pathogens. Now, the true organ system of the immune system is the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a network of organs and vein-like vessels that recover fluids. They inspect those fluids for disease agents, and then they activate immune responses if there's anything in there. After that, they return the fluid to the bloodstream. Remember that about 15% of blood was not able to be reabsorbed into the capillaries and was returned through the lymphatic system. It's almost as if there's a constant sampling rate of the fluids returning into the circulatory system to check them for any pathogens or disease agents. The lymphatic vessels are closely associated with the capillary beds. So this is how they pick up fluid from the tissues and are able to screen all of the blood that's circulating through our body to protect us from infection and disease. There are three main functions for the lymphatic system. The first, that we've already covered, is fluid recovery. The blood capillaries, remember, absorb about 85% of the fluid, but about 15% of it, the remaining 15% of it, which amounts to about 2 to 4 liters per day, is recovered by the vessels of the lymphatic system. It also functions in immunity. Excess filtered fluid is going to pick up foreign cells and chemicals from the tissue. As this fluid passes through the lymph nodes, where immune cells stand guard against all the foreign invaders, they'll activate a protective immune response. So the immune system will send out more cells to gobble up the invaders. The lymphatic system is also involved in lipid absorption. The lacteals in the small intestine absorb dietary lipids that are not absorbed by the blood capillaries. We'll explore this later on in the semester as we look at the digestive system. There are several components in the lymphatic system. First of all, the lymph. That's the fluid that we're recovering. The lymphatic vessels, which actually transport the lymph back towards the heart. The lymphatic tissue, which are composed of aggregates of lymphocytes and macrophages, and they populate many organs in the body. We'll also see lymphatic organs, which is where we see a concentration of these defense cells. They're separated from the surrounding organs by connective tissue capsules. So lymph is a clear, colorless fluid. It's very similar to plasma, but it has less protein. Because as fluid was filtered out of the capillaries, you'll recall that the proteins were left behind. Lymph arises from extracellular fluid that's drawn into the lymphatic capillaries. They carry debris, viruses, bacteria, and cancer cells. Here's an image of the lymphatic capillaries. They penetrate nearly every tissue. They're only absent from the central nervous system, from the cartilage, from cornea, and from bone and bone marrow. The lymphatic capillaries are also termed terminal lymphatics. They're sacs of loosely overlapping thin endothelial cells, and they're closed at the terminal end. The cells are tethered to the surrounding tissue by protein filaments, and the gaps between the cells are large enough to allow bacteria and other cells to enter the lymphatic capillary. So they're much more permeable to large particles than the capillaries themselves. The endothelium will create valve-like flaps, which open when the interstitial fluid pressure is high, and they close when it's low. So as the fluid in the surrounding tissue pushes on the lymphatic vessel, essentially these gateways open, and the fluid is allowed to enter the lymphatic vessels. They're derived from venous tissue, except they have thinner walls and the valves are much closer together. Because they're derived from venous tissue, they still have the three layers that are characteristic of other vessels. The tunica interna has the endothelium and the valves that you see in this figure. The tunica media is where we see elastic fibers and smooth muscle, just as in all the other vessels. And the tunica externa is a very thin outer layer. These terminal lymphatics, or lymphatic capillaries, converge into larger and larger vessels as lymph makes its way back towards the heart. So let's take a look at the route of lymph flow as it does make its way back towards the heart. We've already examined the lymphatic capillaries. They converge to form collecting vessels. These often travel alongside the veins and the arteries and share a common connective tissue sheath with them. At irregular intervals, the collecting vessels will dump their contents into lymph nodes. The lymph nodes will clean it, gobble up any of the bacteria and stuff in the lymph. And notice if there are any invading pathogens. If there are, the immune system will be notified. The lymph will move slowly through each node, and on the other side of the node, they'll travel through another collecting vessel. They'll often encounter additional lymph nodes along the way before they finally return to the bloodstream. Each of these collecting vessels will dump into one of the 6 lymphatic trunks. Each lymphatic trunk will drain one major portion of the body. They're named for their locations and the parts of the body that they drain. The jugular lymphatic trunk, the subclavian lymphatic trunk, the bronchiomediastinal, the intercostal, the intestinal, and lumbar trunks. The lumbar trunk drains not only the lumbar region, but also the legs. These lymphatic trunks will then converge to form 2 collecting ducts. You can see each of the lymphatic trunks in this figure. Don't worry specifically what each trunk drains. Just be aware that there are 6 lymphatic trunks, and each of these 6 lymphatic trunks will converge on either the right lymphatic duct or the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct is formed by the convergence of the right jugular, the subclavian, and the bronchiomediastinal trunks. Thus, it receives drainage from the right arm and the right side of the thorax, as well as the head, and empties into the right subclavian vein. So the right lymphatic duct drains purely this arm, this portion of the thoracic cavity, and half of the head. The thoracic duct on the left is much larger and longer and drains the whole rest of the body. The 2 lumbar trunks join here, and then they form a prominent sac called the cisternar chyli. It's named for the large amount of chyle, which is fatty intestinal lymph, that it collects after each meal. After the lymph passes through the cisternar chyli, it'll pass through the diaphragm with the aorta and ascend into the mediastinum. Here it'll receive additional lymph from the left bronchiomediastinal trunk, the left subclavian, and the left jugular trunks. Then it will empty into the left subclavian vein, right here. So the short story is that the right lymphatic duct drains just this region of the body. The left side, the thoracic duct, drains the whole lower portion of the body, as well as the left side of the body and the left side of the head and the left arm. Here again, you can see another image of this drainage system, but don't get too wrapped up in each of the different trunks. Just be aware of sort of where they are, not specifically what they drain. Here's an example of lymphatic drainage of a particular area. In the breasts, we'll see a lot of lymphatics, and they drain into axillary lymph nodes, and they'll join the right subclavian vein through the right lymphatic duct. When people have surgery for a radical mastectomy, they'll often remove these axillary lymph nodes. These would be the ones that would first be infected with metastatic breast cancer. So lymph flows under the forces that are very similar to those that govern venous return, except that there's no pump. That is, there's no pressure applied from the heart. It flows at very low pressure and slower speed than venous blood. It does move with the rhythmic contractions of lymphatic vessels. As these vessels stretch, because of their muscular layer, they'll also contract and squeeze the fluid back towards the heart. Again, the skeletal muscle pump will play a role. And the pulsation of the arteries that the lymphatic vessels are wrapped with will also aid in return of the lymphatic vessels fluid to the heart. The thoracic pump, just as it did with veins, aids in the flow from abdominal to thoracic cavity, and the valves in the vessels are preventing backflow. Rapidly flowing blood in the subclavian veins actually acts to draw lymph in. So as we increase the rate of circulation, for example with exercise, we'll also increase the lymphatic return and thus cleanse our fluids at a more rapid rate. So yet another reason that exercise is very good for your health. So now I'd like to introduce you to the cells of the lymphatic system. We'll begin with natural killer cells. The natural killer cells are very large lymphocytes. They attack and destroy bacteria as well as transplanted tissue. They'll also attack host cells, cells of your own body that have been infected with viruses, or cells that have turned cancerous. So yes, our own immune system will indeed kill cancer cells. The natural killer cells are responsible for a mode of defense that we'll discuss later that's called immune surveillance. Another couple of lymphocytes are T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. I remember T lymphocytes because they mature in the thymus, and B lymphocytes because they mature in bone. Now, they're not truly B for bone, they're B for the name of where they were discovered in a chicken, in the bursa. However, B for bone works for me for remembering what they do. The T lymphocytes we'll discuss in much more detail later. B lymphocytes differentiate into plasma cells. Now, plasma cells are connective tissue cells that secrete the antibodies of the immune system, and thus they aid in attacking invading pathogens. Macrophages are very large. They're avidly phagocytotic cells that roam around in the connective tissue. They develop from monocytes that have emigrated from the bloodstream. They phagocytize the tissue debris, dead neutrophils, bacteria, and other foreign matter that has been previously killed. They process that matter and then they'll display the antigenic fragments to certain T cells. So they alert these other immune system cells of the presence of an invading enemy. We call cells that do this antigen-presenting cells. So they basically gobble up the invader and then display pieces of that invader on their surface to say, hey, you guys, these are the invaders. T lymphocytes, go ahead and gobble them up. We'll see how all of that works in more detail later. Here's a view of macrophages. They're very large cells. They've got pseudopods, they crawl all over and they gobble up things. Macrophages are like the trash trucks of the immune system that display what variety of trash they've run into. Dendritic cells are sort of like the first line of defense. They're found in the epidermis, the mucous membranes, and in some lymphatic organs, basically on the surface of the body. They alert the immune system to invading pathogens that have breached the body's surfaces. They're also antigen-presenting cells, and they move around and they say, hey, these are the things that we found on the surface. Beware, and they alert the immune system to get ready to fight. They function very similarly to the macrophages, but their focus is on body surfaces. Finally, there are reticular cells. These are stationary cells, and they contribute to the connective tissue framework of a lot of lymphatic organs. They're branched, and thus they create little compartments. They can also act as antigen-presenting cells, but only inside the thymus. So we'll see each of these different types of cells in lots more detail as we continue to explore our immune system functions. But for now, pull out a piece of paper and note down all the different types of cells so that as we progress through the next sets of tissues, you can recognize them as they come up. And we'll pause here and begin our next section with lymphatic tissues and then move into the different lymphatic organs.